You said you defeated the virus and you hadn't.
There was no algorithm by which we could predict that a second wave would be as lethal and as virulent.
Everything that you dislike is politically motivated, is it?
Yes, yes.
At the beginning of the year, India confidently told the world it had defeated the COVID virus, but it hadn't. It's now the second worst affected country in the world after the US. More than 400,000 people are officially reported to have died from the disease, although many fear the true figure is much higher. My guest this week from Delhi is Shazia Ilmi, one of the ruling BJP's national spokespersons. Why the clampdown on journalists and human rights activists during the pandemic? And has India's democracy suffered long-term damage? Shazia Ilmi, welcome to Conflict Zone. January 28th, your Prime Minister boasted, India has saved the world, entire humanity, from a major tragedy by effectively controlling coronavirus. That, of course, turned out to be utter nonsense because, in fact, as the next few months showed, it couldn't have been further from the truth. I wonder what that extravagant assurance was based on. Wishful thinking? Ignorance? Help me out here.
Sure, if you give me some time, Tim. So India conducted an average of 11.7 lakh, which is roughly 1,100,000 tests per day during the first wave, and an average of 1,700,000 tests during the second wave. And there was no way of knowing, that during the second wave, that there will be a 4.23 times the peak number of cases would go up, And there was no algorithm, really, that would predict that the potential increase in numbers or the higher severity or virulence would go up and the transmission, as none was available. And as for, except for Russia, all other countries have done far less testing than India. So India cannot be blamed for having done less testing than any other country, which was the only means available to forecast.
You kept on with these inaccurate assessments. In February, when the number of cases was starting to rise again, your party passed a resolution that included yet another dangerously inaccurate comment. It's the country, it said, had defeated COVID under the able, sensitive, committed and visionary leadership of Prime Minister Narendra Modi. This too was a total misreading of the trajectory of the virus. And I'm wondering, is the BJP too grand and too proud to admit when it gets it so wrong?
No, that's not true at all. You must understand we have a federal structure and health remains is on the concurrent list. So while oxygen and plants and the distribution for those was given to the states, and states should have done that bit, the responsibility was of the states. So you can't put it and place it on the Prime Minister's door.
No, but even then, let me give you defeated the virus and you hadn't. That simply wasn't true.
Because there was no algorithm. There was no algorithm by which we could predict that a second wave would be as lethal and as virulent. Nobody predicted it. Not a single. And how would you expect the Modi government to know that this would happen? But the entire medical fraternity, the entire world, all the virologists, none of them predicted that this will happen. Anyway, and even
so as populists do, you just took the most comforting explanation and assessment and tried to sell it to the people. By March the 7th, you had 18,000 new cases a day, but you went on giving out these flawed assessments. The health minister decided to tell the world that India was in the end game of the pandemic. He said it.
Mr. Sebastian, that is so incorrect, because India, to make the COVID go away and for the second wave to be rendered ineffective, India would have needed 1,888 million doses, because we would need 2 per person to vaccinate the entire population. And by that time, it was impossible to vaccinate so many people before the onset of the second wave. And the entire world had been given only 330 million jabs by then. Which country would have achieved that?
My point, Shazia Ilmi.
No, Mr. Sebastian, you're not getting it.
My point is that you kept on giving false assessments. even though you knew that the situation was not under control,
they
you
were
kept on saying that it was.
They were not deliberate. That was how we understood the situation. And the minute we realized the virulence and how terrible it was, we galvanized into action. And just see what we are doing today. 2 million vaccinations being done a day. And we are beating everybody except for China. And we don't even have the figures from China.
We now know,
so
Shazia
India needed
Ilmi,
as many, and no government in the world would have achieved, even in the entire galaxy, or no superpower or
Shazia
super god
Ilmi,
would have achieved. If
Shazia
you wanted
Ilmi,
to defeat the second wave in India.
let's come back down to earth. We now know that your government ignored. Can I at least put the question? We now know that your government ignored vital and timely warnings from the very body that you set up to advise on COVID. I'm talking about the Indian SARS-CoV Genetics Consortium, known as INSACOG. I'm sure you know the organization I'm talking about. What's the point of setting up a group like this if you don't bother to listen to what it's telling you?
What I'm saying is that nobody predicted that the numbers would be spiked to that degree. And having said that, if I tell you the deaths per million that happened vis-a-vis any other country, India still fared much, much better. It was terrible what happened.
You're missing my point. You're missing my point. In early March, advisors on INSACOG warned officials of a new and more contagious variant. 4 of them said the government failed to impose major restrictions to stop its spread. How do you explain that the government ignored the advice it was getting from the very body set up to advise it?
Government did not ignore. In fact, if you see Prime Minister's tweets throughout, he was the one who kept saying, please wear the mask. It is important. The second wave is coming. And it was at his insistence that at the Kumbh Mela, that the akhadas, which are various sects who assemble there, that they decided to go away and not assemble and congregate at a certain point, which is a big Hindu congregation. So Prime Minister was ahead of it, and he kept saying that. The fact of the matter is this still remains a state subject, and various states are responsible for it. So why do you want to blame the central government for all the pitfalls and all the failures of the various state governments? And having said that, the fact of the matter is, if you compare India and if you look at the deaths per million cases, India has been far better than all the other countries. And I would like to give you some of those figures.
You said, I need to come in here. You keep on offering me comparisons. You keep on getting away from the specific questions that I'm asking you. And I want to put the fact to you that the director of your National Centre of Disease Control, Sujit Kumar Singh, told a private online meeting that strict lockdown measures had been needed in early April, and he had relayed the urgency of the matter to government officials. It was highlighted, he said very, very clearly, that unless drastic measures were taken now, could I finish, please? It would be too late to prevent the mortality which we are going to see. That warning was given on April the 18th. 2 days later, your Prime Minister addressed the nation and dismissed the idea of a lockdown. Why was that urgent advice ignored? He said, we have to save the country from lockdowns. That's what your Prime Minister said. 2 days after receiving this urgent warning from the body set up to advise him.
Let me tell you, from September to April, Prime Minister had 6 meetings with different CMs and warned them of the second wave. These are the 6 meetings. These are 6 different meetings that the Prime Minister had with the different chief ministers of all the states and warned them of the same. 6 official meetings, virtual meetings, and apprised them of the situation. And money was allocated for oxygen plants.
Why
this is from September 20. No, there was no secrecy whatsoever. This is all in the public domain.
In June,
your research team ought to work better and must have better sources.
The research team is listening to what your scientists are telling you.
Yes,
Shazia Ilmi, excuse me, instead of interrupting me, we'd get on better if you would listen to the questions that I'm asking and please provide an answer to them.
I find them biased.
In June, Professor Gautam Menon It doesn't matter.
I find them half-baked and
You may find them half-baked, but these are what your scientists are saying.
It matters.
These are what your scientists are saying.
Which scientists are you talking about?
In June, Shazia Ilmi,
Why didn't they come up with this earlier? Did this scientist tell the Prime Minister? Is there any official, communication from him saying that the cases would go up to 4.23 times in the month of April and May?
Shazia Ilmi, Rakesh Mishra, director of the Center for Cellular and Molecular Biology, said we could have done better. Our science could have been given more significance.
I concede.
Could I finish the question, or will you interrupt every question? We could have done better, he said. Our science could have been given more significance. What we observed, in whatever little way, that should have been used better. In June, Professor Gautam Menon at Ashoka University, talking about secrecy, said that vital data about vaccine effectiveness and reinfection rates was completely unavailable to anyone outside the government system, even though it's mostly the academics who have the expertise to analyze it. What's the point of that? What's the point of that? Completely unavailable to anyone.
The academics you quote, that's why I talk about the confirmation bias and the selective bias. And these academics that you're quoting, their entire purpose, they belong to the unelectable and unelected left and the orthodox left, who just want to puncture every scheme and every achievement of this government, because they're good at. That's all they've ever done.
So anybody who says something you don't like is automatically biased against you.
No, because
that's your argument, is it?
If you say, according to them, nothing good has happened in this country since Prime Minister has taken over. And everything was hunky-dory ever since he took over. And Modi, and let me tell you, let me correct you, because your information is clearly half-baked. Italy had, I'm telling you, death per million cases, 2025, Brazil 1951, UK 1871.
I don't want the comparisons. I just stay with India. I know you'd rather talk about every other country in the world, but let us just stay with India.
Because they're important.
Let us just stay with India, please.
I will answer my question. No. I will. No, this is important. How do you get a perspective on these?
Look, the agreement is that I ask the questions and you answer them. This is the contract that we have here. I want to talk about journalism during this pandemic. The organization Reporters Without... Could I even get the question out without you interrupting me? The organization... The organization Reporters Without Borders... It's going to be impossible unless you actually stop talking for a moment and allow me to ask a question. Otherwise, the interview is pointless, isn't it? The organization Reporters Without Borders says that since the start of the pandemic, reporters in India have been denied access to public interest information, and some are being prosecuted for revealing it. In the latest World Press Freedom Index, you are 142nd out of 180 countries. That's really close to the bottom of the pile, isn't it? Is that where you're happy to be?
I think there's a lot of bunkum, if you ask me. And I don't believe this body at all. I think it's politically motivated.
Everything that you dislike is politically motivated, is it?
Yes. And I think there is a lobby out there, and this is the entire purpose, who look at just bashing Modi and this government, and they are part of an ecosystem which runs a well-orchestrated campaign to demonize Modi and all that is done. So I would like to correct you, and I would like to now, this is my turn to speak, and I hope you will have the courtesy to listen.
You've just answered. I have another question for you. You just answered. You have just answered that. You say it's all politically motivated.
I have not answered it. I have not answered your question. I have merely questioned your subjectivity and your bias. Let me answer the question now. So Italy, for instance, had 20,025 deaths per million. UK had 1,871.
You don't speak for either of these countries. You speak for India. Please stay with India.
Can I speak?
Okay.
So can I speak for India? India had 168 deaths per million. And our healthcare our healthcare facilities are not as great as all of these rich countries. And if we have not a richer economy, you don't blame the Prime Minister of our country, because he has been a Prime Minister 7 out of 73 years, and has been in power, and BJP has been in power only 13 years
Shazia Ilmi, you say that all these people who are criticizing you are politically motivated. I'm wondering whether you think the US...
What are your sources?
I'm wondering whether you think the US State Department is also politically motivated against you when it highlighted a whole catalogue of restrictions that you've imposed on freedom of expression and the press, including, it said, violence, threats of violence, or unjustified arrests or prosecutions of journalists, use of criminal libel laws to prosecute social media speech, censorship, and site blocking. Strange that Mr. Modi didn't mention any of that when he was extolling Indian democracy in the US in the last few days. Why not? Are you embarrassed by these anti-democratic actions that you've taken?
You know something, Mr. Sebastian, you know a little something about me. We were mentioning this before I joined your show. I was a part of anti-corruption movement. I left journalism and I became a part of it. And when I spoke about the UPA corruption, my leader, who was an octogenarian Gandhian, he was thrown into the jail. This is UPA, the previous government. And I wonder why none of these bodies talk about that. If you see the atrocities, if you see the emergency, which was a promulgation signed by Indira Gandhi, you will realize that it is not our government at all. If you see the protests that keep on going on...
So the State Department is wrong. You haven't answered the charges from the US State Department. Are they wrong? Are they politically motivated?
You please come to India, or I'll send you some links. There is an industry in India. If you see the press, they thrive on Modi bashing.
And does the US State Department buy into that as well?
That's why
you haven't answered the charges.
I don't know.
You haven't answered the charges. You haven't answered the charges.
The US, I read the US report on human rights, and they quoted one Rana Ayub. And Rana Ayub's report has not even held up to legal scrutiny. She has based her entire book. She's a fiction writer who writes on, it's like having J.K. Rowling's write on Brexit. It's as hilarious as that. And she is the new champion, the articulator of Indian anguish. And the white man laments and uses these so-called fiction writers like Arundhati Roy to talk about the pain.
Shazia Ilmi, the fact is, though,
it's a bit funny.
The fact is, I'm not going to let you speak endlessly for 10 minutes to answer each question.
And not let me answer.
You've had at least 3 minutes answering it. You've had at least 3 minutes.
Come at me with idiotic reports which have nothing to do with reality.
The State Department's human rights report is idiotic, is it? State Department human rights report is idiotic.
I just mentioned that the State report has quoted Rana Ayub.
Okay, but they weren't quoting her there. They weren't quoting her there.
But you know what, Mr. Sebastian, you will not do one thing. But Mr. Sebastian, you will not do one thing. You are selectively quoting the State report. Can I quote something else from the same report that you're quoting from?
You don't answer the particular questions.
You'll be embarrassed.
No, I'm not embarrassed. I'm not embarrassed in the slightest. I need to move on. Shazia Ilmi, I need to move on because we're wasting time here. I would like to ask you more questions.
You the same State report. I want people to know that how selectively you picked up that bit. And I'm questioning that.
I'm talking about the criticism that was leveled.
That in 2019, the CBI, which is the Central Bureau of Investigation, filed charges against 10 Manipur police personnel for their alleged involvement in the death of a criminal suspect in 2009.
Yes.
This is under Modi's government.
Incident.
This is a state.
One incident.
And
Thank
I can quote you many.
Thank you. You have made the point.
So,
if you would stop shouting at me for a moment, let's look at your worsening human rights record. In the last few weeks, the situation has got even worse with the accelerating crackdown on civil society. Just 2 weeks ago, Human Rights Watch reported fresh raids in different parts of the country on human rights activists, journalists, and other critics of the government. And we're seeing what the group called politically motivated allegations of tax evasion and financial irregularities manufactured to try and silence these people. The government must be very insecure if it's that worried about criticism. Why are you all so jittery in this government?
So you think that the various non-government organizations can take funds from various from overseas and not pay taxes? So tax evasion is allowed. They can violate the foreign exchange regulation authorities. Is that allowed in your country? Would you do that? Would you allow that in your country?
If you've had proof that they've done that,
yes,
you haven't.
Yes, there is.
Otherwise, they'd be in jail. Otherwise, they'd be in jail, and they're not in jail.
Yes, there is proof.
In jail. You just simply harass them continually.
There is a case against them.
You simply harass them continually.
That is not true. There is a case. There are cases against him. There are cases pending against him, and they know that.
I want to mention the case. I want to mention the case of one human rights activist, Stan Swamy, who you arrested in October last year on what one UN Special Rapporteur called fabricated terrorism charges, brought as it happened under the much criticised Unlawful Activities Prevention Act. Despite repeated appeals by the UN to your government, Father Swamy, a Catholic priest who was 84 years old, suffered from Parkinson's disease, was subjected to repeated harassment and interrogation and died in custody on July the 5th after contracting COVID. The Special Rapporteur, Mary Lawler, has said his death will forever remain a stain on India's human rights record. Do you understand why?
Do you realize how incorrect you are? Do you even know that Stan Swamy was actually in the hospital? Do you realize what these misleading reports lead to? Do you know because I have seen this case.
For the last few days of his life, he was repeatedly refused bail. He was repeatedly refused bail.
Because he was involved in violence. He was in Bhibaji, Koregaon violence. He was one of the prime instigators. And the law does not discriminate. If you have perpetrators of crime,
this is a man who dedicated his life to defending the rights of indigenous people. He had severe tremor, according to the UN. According to the UN experts. Are they wrong? Are they making it all up, the UN?
Tell me something. There would be so many Nazi criminals who would be very old, but they were still tried, right? They were Nuremberg trials.
Do you know that suffering from Parkinson's disease, he had severe tremors in both hands?
Yes, but he was...
He asked in November for a drinking straw. He asked in November for a drinking straw and warm clothes, and he was denied both. And he was denied both.
He was a co-conspirator in a very violent riot.
You wouldn't even give him a drinking straw or warm clothes when he asked for them in November.
That is not true. That is again lies.
It beggars belief that a state claiming to be a democracy could treat a sick old man like that.
Do not allow others to speak. You have invited me here to answer your questions. I don't have to listen to all that you are accusing me, our government of. So give me time. He suffered a cardiac arrest in Holy Family Hospital, and he passed away 5 days later. And he was the one who was inciting people and was giving provocative speeches. And he was accused of promoting enmity between different caste groups. And it was he who said the answer has to be in street warfare. The caste conflict can only be resolved by fighting on the streets. Would you allow that in Germany or in London or in UK, the UK?
Your government,
would you allow that?
Your government has double standards.
I don't know. Why would you have double standards in your country and mine? Would you allow violent protests in yours?
Do you know, Shazia Ilmi, we have the case of this man.
You have no business talking to me like this. You're not interrogating me. It is my country as a sovereign right. And people who will be accusing and creating riots in my country will be punished. Just remember that.
He was given no chance to prove his innocence in court. He did not have his day in court.
That is not true.
He was never convicted of anything.
I think your research team is extremely biased, and so are you. You ought to do better. We expect more from you, Mr. Sebastian.
What sentence was he given? Was he convicted, and if so, by which court? Was he convicted?
Do you know the constitution of a country? Do you
know
there are checks and balances?
Was he convicted or not?
Will you listen to me? Will you listen to me? Do you know who does the convictions? The court does the convictions. Please give me 2 minutes or even one. There is executive, legislature, and judiciary. There is something called separation of powers. These are the checks and balances in a democracy, which is why we are a great, vibrant democracy.
Was he convicted, yes or no?
Can you listen to me? You'll have to listen to me. Can you listen to me? So the judiciary decides the conviction, and there is pendency, and it is not good. It is terrible. But the executive and legislature has nothing to do with it. So this has nothing to do with Prime Minister Modi or me. Do you get that? That is the Indian Constitution. So you are saying that we should remove the checks and balances that keep a democracy alive?
No, I didn't say anything at all about that. I said a sick 84-year-old human rights defender
this is the most idiotic
died
way of
without
asking
ever
a question,
having
yes or no.
a day in court to prove his innocence. That's all the point I'm making. Shazia Ilmi, thank you.
That is nothing to do. That is nothing to do.
Thank you for being on Conflict Zone. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.